Yes. Now, I have read Heather's book, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, but you have had the opportunity to read her latest book, Die. And yes, she joins us in the studio, author Heather Morris. And first of all, welcome, Heather. It's a pleasure to have you with us on the show.
Oh, thank you. Pressure's all mine, folks.
Yeah. Now, Heather, your latest book is called Sisters Under the Rising Sun. And I actually attempted to try and do a short synopsis myself. And then I thought, what am I doing that for? Heather can do it for me. She's in the studio. So could you tell everyone about the book?
You know, when I was tasked to write a one-pager about this, I said, you sure you don't want me to write 90,000 words? I'm actually better at that.
Yeah. So the story is based in World War II, but
Yes.
in a different part of the world, not Europe, closer to us, really.
Yeah, look, I'm so delighted to be bringing a story down under, a story that will resonate with Australian and New Zealanders because it's about us, well, a good chunk of it. And it's about women and some children. There weren't many children, but some 500 women who were held captive by the Japanese during the Second World War in the jungles of Sumatra. And the main players are one particular Australian nurse. There was a group of Australian nurses there. There's a beautiful, brilliant English woman, musician, trained at the Royal Academy of Music in London, a Kiwi called Audrey Owen, and we should all know her name, folks. And there's their survival of that 3 years and 7 months as prisoners of war. In fact, they weren't called prisoners of war. You know what? They wouldn't allow them to be called that. Because if they were called prisoners of war, the Japanese would have had to allow them to have Red Cross parcels and to exchange mail. So they called them internees.
Oh, I wondered why that was. So, Heather, how did you come across this story? I often wonder how authors find out about some of these really important times in history.
Well, this one, my publisher in London flagged it with me. She's an Aussie, but she lives now in London. She flagged it with me several years ago, and Three Sisters came along and bumped it. I was talking to some friends, some ex-colleagues, and thought, well, look, you're my vintage. Why don't I sort of ask you if you've heard the name Vivian Bullwinkle? She's a significant player in my story and in history. And one of them said, oh, that's the Australian nurses. And I went, yeah. And she said, oh, one of them was my second cousin.
Wow.
Yeah, I know her story. I know their story. And from that moment on, it had a life of its own. And, of course, the research brought in Nora and the other amazing Dutch nuns and this incredible British missionary, Margaret Dryburgh, and what these women did to survive.
They're incredible stories.
Yeah, Heather, as you walk your way through the telling of a story like this and you do your research and you bring it about, what surprised you, or was there any part of the story that really stood out and surprised you as it began to take shape?
Well, surprised, but actually really, really made me angry were how badly these women were treated when they were returned home, both to England and to Australia, how they were ignored. And the reason given for them being ignored and their suffering not being in any way credited the same way the men. I mean, let's just take the English women. They returned to England on the same troop ship as the main prisoners of Changi prison camp and the other prisoner camps in Japan. And those women were told to stay below, not let any of their family come to the dock to welcome them home, because the men deserved a hero's welcome home, not them. And so, they're shunned. The Australian nurses got a little welcome home in Perth, and then they were told, now go away and do not talk about it and pretend it never happened. So I think it's more that they were decided that they're to be written out of history, and I want them put back in.
I'm so glad you did put them back into history, because I learned so much through reading this book. And I think what I learned was how strong the human spirit can be and resilience. And in fact, how creativity actually played a part in these women's resilience. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, because that surprised me.
Music, the power of music, guys.
Yeah.
If you look at the cover, you will see some two scores of music. That is Ravel's Bolero. That is taken from a piece of paper that I have held, written by Nora Chambers 80 years ago in the jungles in Sumatra.
Wow.
This particular piece of music is significant in the story, as you know. And they used music not just choirs, not just singing. They started off, of course, with Margaret Driver, the missionary, holding church services, and it was more church music. But then they went out into choirs singing, well, the kind of songs that everyone would sing of the time. But then Nora took it one step forward and created this vocal orchestra using women's voices to replicate the instruments of Mozart and Mendelssohn and Schubert and of course, Ravel. And so music, that which can uplift us at the worst of times, and we still use today in medical settings as therapy. Well, this is where it was being played out. And wow, what a role it had in 1942 to 1945 in the jungles of Sumatra.
Yeah, certainly an incredible tale. And there was something about how that music brought these women together that I think played a part in their survival.
Sisters Under the Rising Sun, author Heather Morris with us. And just before we close, Heather, you talked about wanting to see these women not written out of history, but written into history. When you think about these stories, and not only this one, but others that you've written too, why do you think it's important to bring them to life in this way?
You know, I'm not trying to be sexist here and say that women have been written out. Well, they have. But it's not a sexist thing for me. It's more of a human thing. There are stories beyond that which make the movies and make the books and tell of the gallant struggles of these soldiers in the army. Too often the collateral damage of the civilians has been ignored. And it's all part of the same story. You can't tell one aspect and ignore the others. Well, you shouldn't. We've done it for long enough. So you have civilian stories, these stories. Always remembering too that those Australian nurses were members of the Australian Army.
Yeah. Heather, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. It is just the cover itself is gorgeous. And then when I got to the end, and Tom, I discovered photos of the women I'd been reading about. It really was quite spectacular. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you again for being a part of the show.
My pleasure. Thank you. I do appreciate this chance to talk to you.
All right. And I believe in stores tomorrow. So look out for it. Sisters Under the Rising Sun from Heather Morris.